While we're doing that, I did get a note from Barry Walker. Please keep him in your thoughts and or prayers. I think his mom got pretty sick, so he won't be able to join us tonight. But
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah. While we're doing that, I did get.
Okay. You're live on YouTube.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, everybody. I know, thank you to all for sending out the agenda and Janine for the chapter. I know that it came out yesterday and this one's pretty dense, so you may not have had a chance to look at it all. Admittedly, I didn't get through all of it. But we'll pay attention. I am going to keep us tight to the 2 hours tonight for personal reasons, because I've got to take a work call at 8:30. And just playing ahead, we're going to get through this chapter today. Then we're going to take a break in October, and then Janine will go through the entire plan in November and December meetings. Right? Is that the plan?
Yes.
Great. We'll have to talk about the date of the December meeting because that might fall between Christmas and New Year's. So we'll have to talk about that. Maybe if there's time tonight, we can figure that out. So the order of business tonight will be review the chapter. Then we'll have public comment. And then I think if there's time, we'll get to some other lingering comment. Because I just want to make sure that we get through the chapter and at least have the public comment part. And then we can go to any other business, which I really hope that I want to get to. So without further ado, you want to just kick it off? I'm going to go on mute here and attempt to have a little bit of dinner while we do this. Okay.
Perfect. So this is the future land use chapter. It does talk about different land use recommendations. Also, you'll notice in the back of the chapter, basically when we were going through the other chapters, the task force wanted to have a lot of land use recommendations in each chapter. I was trying to fold them as much into this one chapter as possible, just so that we wouldn't have repetition. I know there was a lot of eagerness to get some of the land use recommendations out in the subject areas. So when you read through this chapter, you'll notice that some of it does sound like other things you've already looked at in other chapters. And then at the very end are the agricultural retention and then the Kimblesville Village Enhancements chapter, future land use recommendations. I was trying to recommend having them folded into this chapter, but we were reviewing those chapters. The decision of the task force was to keep them in those chapters. It didn't make sense to review the recommendations during the chapter because the recommendations would have to be vetted against these recommendations in this chapter just to make sure everything meshes together. That's why they're stuck at the end of this chapter, just so you know. But I did put a note in there saying, because you all wanted, they'll go back into their respective chapters when we're all done. So that being said, we have our vision statement here, of course, and then we have the goal. And the goal is something we've talked about over and over again, and actually is a little bit repetitive of the vision statement, balancing preservation and growth and the ability of the land to accommodate uses and population, and then also in concert with resources, ag protection, community facilities planning, to foster continuation of the township or Franklin's rural identity. Pretty much mimics what's in the vision statement. Is that an okay goal for this particular land use chapter with everybody?
I think it's fine.
I'm okay.
Okay, then moving on to the community input. There was input about the types of land uses that the community wanted. Overall, an interesting finding was that one of the main reasons why people would leave the township is because the township is becoming too developed and changes to local character. And then growth management was also very important. These are some of the top reasons why this chapter is drafted as it is drafted. And also these went into the vision statement and how the vision statement is structured. Just very briefly overview, generally, survey respondents wanted commercial uses along major roads in or near the village, maybe possible mixed use patterns, parking in the rear to follow that village kind of, more traditional development type where you don't have parking in the front. You have the buildings pushed up the front, you have smaller buildings and then parking in the rear. And then some survey respondents, and we thought it was worth noting, didn't want to have any new commercial or industrial uses in Franklin Township. So something to note as well. And I think that gets back to the whole idea of rural character and commercial uses, at least traditionally being thought of as maybe something like a corporate park or a strip mall, and maybe not always people thinking of, individual uses in this more villagey pattern. If there's new housing, basically the consensus was that various housing patterns would be appropriate. So there wasn't one particular housing pattern necessarily that was absolute, but in general terms, out of all the different patterns presented, the whole larger lot individual residence, which basically characterizes more of a rural environment, was preferred, followed by then residential developments that would preserve open space. And I think the variation of housing and how it would be built also reflects the fact that you have a village and you have some existing housing developments, and then there's a lot of rural land as well. So I think it was more of the housing should be, responsive to where it is in the township and also the township's rural character. Then moving on to future policy for land uses. So didn't want to repeat what's already been discussed up here. So that's why it says not otherwise covered by responses. Basically promote and retain agricultural uses, having housing that's affordable to middle income people. People wanted housing that age in place. And again, mainly having single family on larger lots. People wanted home occupations. There were some people interested in daycare and office uses. And then maintaining or limiting retirement community assisted living facilities, basically some of the larger scale residential or institutional types of facilities was the takeaway there. And then promoting smaller scale commercial uses and limiting larger scale commercial developments. Promoting existing neighborhoods, and then also promoting the concept of ecotourism, the park and recreation network. In terms of land uses, people clearly wanted parks, open space, et cetera, to be land uses. And then also, the nature preserved were all preserved land or preferred land uses. Other input that we got, we also did not just the survey, but remember, we also did stakeholder talks. And then we also did 2 different input meetings, public input meetings. So those variety of other types of inputs, there was a focus definitely on attracting and retaining small businesses. The large scale retail strip malls would detract from Franklin's character. There are good agricultural soils, and there needs to be options to promote agriculture through various types. And we talked in this task force also about some of the part-time farming types, and the word hobby farming was specifically something people were interested in. And then through the interview with the charter school, discussion of a micro farm at the charter school was also of interest to the charter school. And then secondary agricultural businesses through agritourism. And another point that was made during the input process was that agricultural uses, while sometimes are bucolic and very scenic, but agriculture is an industry, and the uses are not always bucolic and scenic. So when there is a desire to promote the agricultural industry as the main industry, it's not necessarily always going to be that beautiful bucolic scenery. And overall, the conclusions were additional growth should be directed to already developed parts of the township. New businesses would be welcome. Some would be welcome in Kimballsville and along major roadways, and basically where there's existing infrastructure and existing development, so that more of the township isn't opened up for planning new infrastructure or planning new development. So pretty much all in line with the vision and all in line with what this task force, has talked about from day one. So then moving on to the context, like we always do, we talk about the background context, and we talk about more of a county-wide context and then a regional context. The county has the comprehensive plan, which is called Landscapes 3, and that was adopted in November 2018. And basically, the Vision Partnership grant program that this project is funded under, one of the items that the grant program says is that the comprehensive plans that are funded under the grant program and other projects that are funded under the grant program will be consistent in general terms with Landscapes 3, and particularly the map that I'm referencing. In that map, there's 2 major landscapes in the township, and one is suburban. And I'm going to bring up the map for you now. Oop, I am not going to bring up the map for you now. Hold on one second. Here it is. Let me make it bigger so you guys can see it. So there's 2 major landscapes in Franklin, and one is suburban. And that is largely, as you're seeing, along 896 and pretty much in Kimballsville. And then the other is rural, and that's like this greenish tannish color, which is the vast majority of the township. There's a little bit of suburban up here as well, where some development has happened along northern border. But the vast majority of the township is shown as this rural designation. And then this green designation shows general natural landscapes. It wasn't meant to map every single woodland, every single preserve. It was meant to show where streams are, where floodplains are, where some major steep slopes are, where some major wetlands are. So to get at the core kind of constraints that are natural resources. And then also there's a historic landscape overlay. And on the historic landscape overlay, you can see Kimballsville Village and the outline for the village, at least the National Register Historic District. So from a county policy perspective, basically, that's what you're reading about here, what the suburban landscape, what the rural landscapes are, and then the fact there's the natural landscape and then the historic landscape. Then we go to the regional perspective and we look at what's going on in the neighboring municipalities. And we do this because it's good to do for planning purposes, but we also do this because the municipality's planning code, which enables a comprehensive plan in Pennsylvania, requires municipalities to look at the greater region and what is going on in the greater region. So we went through and looked at the general land use pattern. This isn't supposed to be a detailed analysis of every parcel. This is supposed to be how do the land use patterns between Franklin and the adjoining municipalities mesh? And it's more of a heads up, are there going to be conflicts along your borders if a land development, for example, would cross a border, or if there's 2 different uses planned, one on one side of the border, one on the other side of the border, that are going to create conflicts, is really what the discussion is. And then we also looked at Cecil County, Maryland, because even though that's not Pennsylvania planning code, it still does adjoin Franklin. And obviously you have a relationship with them, and what they do impacts you and what you do impacts Cecil County. So overall, the discussion is saying that the conclusion is basically there aren't any significant obstructions or unusual conflicts in the land uses along the border from a very high level, like a 10,000 foot level. And then we move on to existing conditions in Franklin Township. And this is where we're starting to talk about what exactly is on the ground in Franklin Township. Go over the municipality's planning code a little bit, go over the general nature of Franklin Township's existing conditions in terms of land use patterns, talk a little bit about the zoning ordinance and some of the zoning designations in the districts, and then really go into what are the existing land uses in the township. And if you remember, I'm going to close this map. If you remember a while ago, last year, there's your zoning map. I don't know if you want to look at that, but I'll leave that up for a second that we'll talk about later. That's your future land use from your current comp plan. Your existing land use map is somewhere under here. Here it is. Last year sometime we had produced an existing land use map for you all, and you've received this map over and over again when I send out bundles of maps. So it's not anything new. We do create it using there's county assessment data, and that assessment data has a land use code on it. And so we do use the land use code on the assessment data. It is meant to be obviously a parcel-based map of what your existing land use is. And it's meant to give the general picture of what your existing land use map is, not a detailed analysis. But if you do go through this map and you want to provide any comments to me on anything that's blatantly wrong, and again, I mean, if it looks pretty much, again, it's an overview and it's a snapshot in time. But if there's anything that's blatantly wrong and you want to let me know, then when we go through the final draft of the plan, we can make the changes in the final draft of the plan on, to reflect what your existing land use is and what the snapshot in time would be for whenever we last edit the map.
Jeannie, I did have a question about the map.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at where Chesterville is, there are 2 properties that are called out as mixed use. What is that supposed to mean?
Well, based on how, I'm just doing this for everybody else. Mixed use is this kind of red, yellow, red stripes. Basically, however the county has the assessment data when they do the assessment, and the assessment's for tax purposes, to be clear, it's not for land use purposes, but it's the closest data that we have that we can use for these purposes. Whenever they do the assessment, however they've labeled the land use codes under the assessment data, they must have written something like commercial/residential in that information for then us to come back and say mixed use. But that's what it means. It means it's some kind of combination of commercial and residential together, whether it's primarily commercial, primarily residential,
Well,
half and half.
okay, one's in a development and the other's just an old farm. Doesn't this kind of open it up that they're the landowner can say, well, it's labeled as mixed use? That's not what our zoning says in any way.
Well, zoning has nothing to do with the existing land use map. The existing land use map is just reflecting what's on the ground. And there's often things on the ground that do not meet zoning, because of nonconformities, because of changing in zoning. So they're really 2 entirely different animals. That's why there's whole sections of zoning codes that talk about what to do if the use isn't permitted in the current, zoning district, and how you address that. So no, this literally it would be that somebody took a snapshot in time and said, these are the land uses that are on the ground as of X date. So that's why I said, if there's any changes that need to be made to the map, just let me know.
Yeah.
And we can make the changes to the map, and then we can show you the map again, next time.
I think both of them are wrong.
Yeah.
I just think they're wrong.
Okay. Well, if you can let us know what would be right, that would be great. And anybody else that wants to email me changes, we can go ahead and make the changes to the map. So,
Okay.
So thank you. I appreciate that. So getting back to the chapter itself. So the existing land use, again, as I was saying, is really an overview of a snapshot in time of what's going on the ground. And this kind of gets into the background information, just like we've done the background information of every other chapter. It just so happens in this chapter, the background information is much more of a single topic, I'll say, and that is what is existing on the ground. If we're going to talk about the future land uses and how the future land use should be changed, then we should, have a general idea of what the existing land use is. Notice that in this discussion, acreages and percentages have not been finalized because of what you were all saying just a second ago, that maybe some of the designations on the map aren't correct. So there's no point coming up with acreages at this point and percentages if the designations on the map aren't correct. But in general terms, Paul keeps coming back in. In general terms, it's pretty common to split up existing land uses into single family detached homes the 2-family detached homes, and those would basically be your twins, your side by side, or your duplexes 1/1. Your multifamily is considered housing structures that have 3 or more dwelling units. So twins, meaning houses that are side by side, are not considered multifamily units. Multifamilies start with triplexes, townhouses, apartments, those sorts of things. Mobile home parks, of course, are a land use category. Then we have commercial, the mixed use we were just talking about, which are commercial and residential uses combined onto one lot, maybe into one building or maybe just on one lot. Institutionals, which is your charter school, your churches, you have your industrial, agriculture is its own category. Then we look at parks and recreation, and then we look at various types of open space. We look at open space that was formed by a residential development in that process, and then we look at open space that was preserved in other ways. So that could be a township preserve. That could be a land conservancy preserving open space, like Peacedale Preserve. Then we look at undeveloped lands. There's very few undeveloped lands in Franklin. I think there's maybe 2 lots that are undeveloped. Because remember, agriculture, sometimes people think agriculture is considered vacant. It's not considered vacant. It is, land in active use as agriculture. So it's really undeveloped lots that are sitting there with no use. And then, of course, there's how many acres all of your utilities and your roadways, whether they're public or private roadways, take up as the basic categories.
Excuse me, Janine, I'm getting a message from Paul. He might have a question and is having a hard time connecting. Oh, there you go, Paul. You there? So his box is highlighted yellow, so it's recognizing noise, but we're not hearing him.
Okay, he's tried to come back into the meeting a couple times.
Yeah. Maybe there's a dial-in. He should probably use his phone for audio instead of the computer.
Yeah, there's a dial-in that's on the township's website.
I'll try to get that for him. Keep going, and I'll try to help him here.
Okay, thank you. So then recommendations and actions. Whoa, sorry about that. Okay, so recommendations and actions. The first recommendation, and remember, just as a refresher, we had talked about the recommendations and actions last October through last December at these meetings. And so the recommendations, which you're seeing now in 8.1, and then the hows or the action items under there, those were all things that we talked about. And now what we're doing at this meeting is we're looking at the action steps. We're not really rehashing the hows or the recommendations. We're looking at the specific action items under each of those, under the recommendations and then the respective actions. So this general recommendation was direct development to appropriate areas of the township. And you heard in the public input that was a theme that recurred over and over again. So now it's turned into a recommendation. We wrote a blurb on why do this. And basically it just rehashes what I've been talking about and what the community input provided. So then the first action item that we talked about, and this was direct growth to already developed areas, development away from rural areas and environmentally sensitive areas, and then direct development around Kimblesville. So then what's new for you all to see are these bullet points.
Join the meeting.
That's Paul. I heard it say Paul. Paul? You're probably still on mute. You might have to take it off mute.
Okay, I just let a phone enter the meeting. I assume that's Paul. Oh, now Paul's entering the waiting room also. Okay, so the first action under the action under the direct growth is basically directing growth towards of higher densities towards Kimblesville Village. And you'll notice, as I said in the very beginning of the meeting, that some of these recommendations and actions start to get a little bit repetitive. Like this will sound a lot like the actions that are going to be in Kimballsville Village, just because of the nature of, splitting things up between different chapters. But basically direct growth, higher densities to Kimballsville to allow the remainder of the township to try to keep the rural character residents desire. And we heard that in the public input. And then the next action item that we had decided on was focusing small scale businesses. And then this mixed use commercial and residential around Kimballsville. So how you do this is the use and the scale, should say sizes. The use and the scale should be compatible with the village scale. And this would be in zoning to make sure that it is compatible. There is a type of zoning called traditional neighborhood development regulations, and those could be considered within the V district. And that's a type of regulation that also comes with design standards. And that would expand beyond just the local historic district. In Kimballsville, that would expand to the whole V district. And then just review the design standards within the local historic district, Kimballsville, to make sure they discourage what we used as corporate architecture, which is basically what the respondents to the survey said, that they don't want to see the strip mall and the office parks and those kind of traditional types of suburban-y buildings within the township anywhere, and particularly in the historic parts of the township. And then also to get at the survey results, focusing industrial and commercial uses further out from Kimballsville along Route 896. So this is where we talk about examining that current SU district and determining if it's in its current form and location, it's still appropriate, or do those uses have to go into another district? Can SU basically be merged into another district? Or does it need to be expanded, shrunk in size, moved to another part of the township? So when you get to the zoning ordinance, those would be things you would look at. And we've just given you a couple different options for how the SU district could be handled when you get to the zoning district. You don't have to have just to be clear, you don't have to have a district called special use district, SU district. All the municipality planning code requires is that you permit all types of uses in the township. So you could call the district A, B, C, D if you wanted. You could combine those uses into your industrial district or whatnot. Just to be clear, that's why in bullet point A, we gave that there's a couple different options you could do to address that SU district. And it does not have to keep that form or that name in order to address the uses in that district. So, and basically what I just said in summary is what's spelled out in more detail here. Then moving on, low density zoning in appropriate areas to permit hobby farms. This was something that we had talked about, particularly Barry was interested in this. I think he brought the suggestion to the table, saying that hobby farms are a very, very realistic option in Franklin, where people want to buy larger properties, larger than 1 or 2 acres, 5, 10, 15 acre properties, and then often have jobs outside of the property, but then as a side business have their hobby farm where they're either doing horses or chickens or gardens or selling vegetables, etc. And so we talked about that in a task force meeting and then decided that was worthy to include in as a recommendation, as a very real thing that's already happening in Franklin, and as a reason people continue to want to buy larger properties in Franklin Township. Then in rural areas, make sure that land developments do continue to preserve large amounts of open space. Currently in the zoning ordinance, there is a open space design option, so that if new land developments happen for residential uses, large amounts of agriculture are preserved. And we were recommending considering amending the open space standards for these open space and recreation requirements to also allow for active agricultural lands to be counted. And then getting at the zoning recommendation, also review the standard, getting it another land development recommendation. Also, look at that to see if there's ways you can incentivize the larger continuous areas of open space and agricultural lands, to be preserved through incentives in your ordinance. Then look at the open space, the subdivision ordinance. Right now, the subdivision ordinance does have site responsive development criteria in it. And as we note here, and really it's just to review the recommendations to make sure that with the comp plan policy that you're putting forth here, that the regulations still do take into account the capacity of the land in a way you envision now that you have the new policy. So it's not starting from scratch, it's taking what you already have and just refining it and making sure it meshes with this policy.
Janine, can you go back to the portion that talks about agriculture and open space? That's kind of a shift from what we've done in the past. Traditionally, we have a development. We did cluster the homes, but we didn't have agriculture on the remainder of the property. We had open space or wooded space.
And that's what we talked about when we went through the house, last year, as I was saying, October through December, we talked about how to further encourage agriculture to be preserved and not just have open space in these land developments, but consider if active ag, because if you have agriculture in some of these land developments, then you have somebody effectively leasing the land or maintaining that land for you, as opposed to having it fall into a homeowners association, having to maintain the open space. So it's another option for how to keep agricultural active in the township and, open up opportunities for not just having the open lands, for lack of a better term, in these residential developments be preserved open space. So I know it's not something you had done before. That's why the recommendation, that's why it was something that came out of this process.
Okay.
Yeah, other places do it. And particularly if there's a farmstead, in place and the development occurs around the farm, then effectively either the property owner is selling off part of the property and having some of the property developed as residential uses and then preserving the farm, the active farm property to continue to farm, or that what was an active farm property is then leased back to somebody else to use it as a farm. And that's even happening in some of our preserved open space, because we've talked about the maintenance of the open space. Once it's preserved, somebody still has to maintain it. So there's some places, even some municipal parks I can think of, and land conservancy open space, where they're actually taking their open space and they're having a farmer come in and, have hay or have rotational crops or have corn or whatever, just to be able to maintain that open space. So
yeah, but that's not in association with land development. We're not having both of them happen on the same property. I think this encourages development.
It encourages development by saying you can have a farm in the open space?
It encourages development because now you don't have to break up an entire farm. You can break it in half. So it's just the first time I have heard it and thought about it from this angle, and I don't know if I'm the only one, but this a little bit, it's in my opinion a little pro development.
Okay, does anybody else have any comments?
Well, Paul has some. Windermere Farms their HOA open space currently, and Franklin Preserve is farm. So I don't know how that adds to the conversation. I'm still absorbing what Chuck just said.
Yeah, I just thought I would stop it and have a conversation about it because
Yeah,
it definitely would lend itself to, even a larger property, maybe a third of it or half of it during a tough time gets developed. And I don't know. It's worth consideration.
acquire any land.
Well, I guess the other option is all of it could be developed. If during a tough time, they could just sell the whole thing for open space instead of continuing to farm at least part of the property. Could be
Yeah,
another
so
side of
so
the
that,
equation.
yeah.
So
I understand that, but
what does everybody else think? So we can
Um,
move on to other recommendations.
so is this talked about in other chapters? Janine, is this one of those things where it's covered in other chapters?
It's not really covered on, this isn't one of the ones so much covered in other chapters because this is really just a straight up.
So this one stands alone.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll scroll down and look at the ag retention ones, but I don't believe it's talked about in the ag retention because ag retention is really getting at more of the business, side of it as opposed to like the zoning and like, I guess the land use zoning. It's how do you keep agriculture as a business through more of incentives and that sort of thing. So
Let's read this again. So
no, I don't think.
Well, in rural areas require that any land development preserve agricultural lands through zoning and SLDO measures. So Chuck, restate your problem again.
well, my problem is that I think that this, although it's intended to create farmland, I believe what it's going to do is reduce the amount of farmland because it's going to allow for development of partial farms, part of the
Gotcha.
larger properties.
Instead of
And
preserving the farm, keeping the farm
Yeah,
intact.
I'm not seeing the variable where all of a sudden we're creating agricultural land. I'm seeing just the variable where we're taking away from agriculture.
Gotcha. And retaining agricultural land. It does not address retaining agricultural land.
Right.
Right.
All it does is it preserves a portion of a larger farm.
Yeah. I see what you're saying.
Chuck, when I looked at this, I thought it was encouraging cluster development and maintaining the ability to farm the rest of the property.
It is.
Yeah. So that would be reducing the amount of agricultural land.
So can we suggest an edit here that strengthens that? Because I totally see what you're saying.
Yeah, but doesn't the owner of the property have the right to develop it? And this just encourages cluster development.
Yeah.
If they're going to develop it, it's saying try to keep a portion of it in agriculture, at least, as opposed to either keeping 100% in agriculture and continuing to farm it, or just developing it, either conventional, with large lots, or an open space development. It's trying to give them an alternative. So yes, I guess it just depends on what the viewpoint is. If it's going to be sold, it's going to be sold. And is it better to try to have some of it retained as ag, or is it better to try to say to the farmer, are there other options so you don't sell the land? Which is what the ag retention, chapter that we've already talked about tries to get to. So we never get to this point, but it's up to you in terms of policy.
Well, that's why I was asking if there was a relationship in another chapter, because I thought there was in the ag retention chapter. All right, well, let's move on.
Basically trying to keep ag retention, or trying to keep ag as much as possible. And if it's going to be developed and you've lost, keeping ag on a particular parcel, if it's going to be developed, then what are the options for development? And this was sort of potentially a best case scenario option as another possibility. So anyway, it's up to you policy wise. If we could just make a decision on what you want to do or what wording you want to change and then move to the next recommendation, that would be great.
I don't see anything. I mean, I'm struggling to rewrite this right here, right now. I don't know, Chuck or Jerry.
It sounds like I'm alone in this concern, so we can move on.
All right. I mean, I did, when you said it, I can understand what you were, how that could be interpreted. All right. Well, if anybody's struck with anything meaningful, we can come back and squeeze it in. Otherwise, I think I feel better that it's covered in the ag retention chapter. So
The other half of it is, right, trying to preserve the farms in the first place.
so is there a linking opportunity here to say see ag retention chapter for more detail, or is that possible?
I could put a note in here saying something like, also see, I'll work on the wording of this note, but also see, I think it's chapter 3.
Is that a better safety net for you, Chuck? It is for me because it points them back to.
Yeah, I would prefer to see. I'm concerned that half of a farm is likely to get sold as opposed to somebody making the hard decision of selling the whole thing.
And is that, oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
That resonates with me. I understand. All right, well, let's keep moving, and I'll look in the other chapter and see maybe if there's stronger language you can borrow from somewhere else to reinforce it.
Oh, it's further down, the ag retention stuff. It's further down, so.
Oh, all right, well, maybe it's in here then. Let's keep going. Good idea.
Okay, so determine if there are ways to reduce conflicts with agriculture and residential developments. So information is part of reducing the conflicts. A lot of times people will move to a rural community thinking this is really cool to live in a rural community, and then not really realize what they've gotten themselves into by living in a rural community where there's tractors and odors and those sorts of things. And then also we have a great resource at the county level, the Agricultural Development Council. And this, the economic development of agricultural parcels is basically, or agricultural lots is basically right up their alley. So how do you promote educational strategies to let people know where they're moving and what they're moving next to, and to be sure this is really where they want to live? So then review zoning. This is just a very general one, reduce nonconformities. And this is what we were talking about before, existing land use map versus what is in zoning. So next time the township does an update to the zoning ordinance, a good thing to do would be to look at if the township is receiving significant amounts of applications for variances, that sort of thing in certain parts of the township. That would be a heads up that there's too many nonconformities between those land uses, those lot sizes, and that zoning. And it might be a time to reconsider how that area of the township is zoned. This is always important when you do update the zoning ordinance. Whenever you do it, you have to make sure that the various land uses are permitted in your zoning ordinance. And per the municipality's planning code, that means every type of land use has to be permitted somewhere in zoning. There's often a catch-all district because there's land uses we haven't even thought about. It's impossible to name every single one. But that's just important to consider when you are updating the zoning. It's more of a heads up. And then when you're reviewing and updating zoning and subdivision ordinance, also just make sure the procedural aspects are current for both of those ordinances. Land use or case law, periodically changes some of the procedural aspects from what is in the municipality's planning code. So just make sure that the ordinances are up to date. So then the second major category here for recommendations is revitalization, and basically supporting revitalization of existing buildings and existing developed sites. And this gets at, again, what we heard at the very beginning of this meeting, where I was talking about the resident input, and that is develop where it's already been developed and discourage opening up additional developments onto what's called green fields, or land that has not been developed yet. So look at incentives and zoning for redevelopment. And types of incentives, usually in zoning, Pennsylvania law, because of how it works, incentives are relatively limited in what you can do, but density bonuses, for example, for residential units is something you could look at. Dynamic lot and bulk sizes. And that means instead of having a set area and bulk, there could be modifications for increases for height, shallower setbacks, those sorts of things to encourage redevelopment. Maybe a charrette with property owners that have properties that are developed, but they would like to have them redeveloped to figure out what incentives would be most powerful and most helpful in the redevelopment process. If there's additions onto existing buildings, consider how those additions would work, and also maybe encourage existing buildings to have additions rather than somebody picking up to a whole new lot and want to start afresh anew on a lot that's never been developed in the township before. And just generally looking at what kind of adaptive reuse standards you could have in zoning that would encourage buildings to be reused.
Does that really apply to our township? I mean, I know it's significant in more developed townships, but we're talking about 90% is houses. So that doesn't apply. I guess we could say the Sunoco should be considered if somebody wants to put in, but that's about it. I mean, we really don't, I think this is not really about, this is a higher density application.
Well, I think people were thinking too about some of the uses that are along 896. A couple of the uses, if they went out of business. We talked to like one industrial use when we did the interviews, if that would go out of business. I don't know if the pizza shop would change over. So this was definitely something, this was a recommendation or an action that the task force wanted back between October and December. And the land use pattern hasn't changed yet. So since then,
okay,
something that we heard through the survey. So I don't know how it hurts having it in here, but it's up to you all what you want to do on it.
Nope.
Anybody else want to comment, or what do you all want to do? It's your plan. Comment on, what you want to have happen. If there aren't any other comments, I'm going to move on. We talked about this too with ag, and this recommendation came out of talking to the business community when we did that interview about the business community. The business people we talked to thought it would be kind of a cool idea to have a working group to focus on site redevelopment. And apparently years ago, there was some kind of at least informal working group in the township where the businesses in the township would get together and talk about these things and business improvement and business retention. And so having the community get back together and talk about these things. And in this case, because this is the land use chapter, and remember, as I said before, the chapters are segmented up. So some of this stuff does overlap other chapters, which makes it difficult because now you're hearing one small angle of a much larger concept, and the larger concept is in another chapter. But get together the business community in this part of the recommendation to talk about how they can improve their properties or how they can build additions, whatnot, on their properties rather than build in another part of the township. And then existing businesses, we talked about this quite a bit, and there was definitely interest from the task force, particularly with all the work from home that's been going on, about how to make sure work from home businesses, and then also any businesses in any commercial buildings, and are encouraged to, to stay in place and how they're supported. And remember, this is a 10-year plan. So when saying existing businesses, it could be a business existing 5 years ago that's still in place, or it could be a business that comes in place 5 years from now. And because this is a 10-year plan, that would be an existing business, in terms of this plan. So if what the plans are for Kimballsville and the buffer area directly around Kimballsville do occur, then there could be, a more filled in land use pattern in those areas, potentially coming up within the time frame of this plan. So I just want to throw that out there. So the first recommendation, or the first action item that we all talked about, is how do you review zoning in particular to encourage home occupations? There was concern that there were going to be a lot more home occupations and people building businesses out of their homes, and maybe the township code didn't support that. So the municipality's planning code does require no impact home-based businesses, and these are basically, your ordinance calls it home occupations, but basically they're permitted by right in all residentially zoned districts, and they allow for less intensive types of in-home businesses. Basically, a computer programmer, somebody that's going to be sitting, running a business quietly without visitation, etc. Then in the current zoning ordinance the township has, there's another level of home occupations or home-based businesses that are these more intensive uses where you might have another employee or two working out of your house, or you might have a lot of deliveries, or you might have clients visiting. And we were recommending here, based on what public input wanted, you all wanted, that making sure when you look in zoning that there is that capacity for the second tier of home occupations, and how could you potentially increase that capacity to have the second tier of more intensive home occupations, to encourage these existing businesses or possibly future businesses to continue in the home. Then just a general one, review zoning as it relates to these accessory uses and expansions and et cetera. And importantly, taking into account that the business and economic viability is important, for the township, obviously. And we had talked about this in some of our other meetings, just the accessory uses, being able to do these other events. The accessory secondary uses really go beyond a home occupation. They really are a whole second use. And in zoning, you have the primary uses listed in zoning ordinances, and you also have permitted accessory uses. And that's where this recommendation is saying, consider those accessory uses and how they really help promote other types of business in the township that may not be recognized as, your traditional storefront business. And then also the wayfinding signage and all of that. Accessory uses, and we've talked about this also, often you get a farm where you have an accessory business use. Like you may have, a vineyard, and then you have the winery on the vineyard, but the main use is actually the winery. I'm sorry, the main use is the vineyard, and the secondary use is the winery that's open to the public. And that's an agritourism, effectively a secondary associated business with the vineyard. So last in this chapter is talking about housing and planning for housing needs. The municipality's planning code does require that a variety of housing is allowed under zoning in each municipality in the Commonwealth. And you remember a while back, earlier this year, we talked a little bit about the fair share of housing analysis that was done in 2019 and what the conclusions of that were. And basically, it was to continue to provide for multifamily housing and a variety of housing types. So the first recommendation is just saying that you have to meet state law. Don't get yourself in a bad position. According to that fair share analysis that I just referenced, there does appear to be adequate acreage within the HDR district to then meet the needs for multifamily uses. But through this planning effort, there's been definitely a desire to have multifamily looked at in maybe parts of the township that can better accommodate it, that are less rural, less agriculturally based. And that would be Kimballsville, the areas around Kimballsville. And also we talked to the areas around the existing townhouse development which is used as apartment rentals. There might be an ability to expand multifamily there as needed. And, so when reviewing the zoning in the future, maybe that HDR category sitting in a more rural area of the township, maybe that isn't the best location for multifamily going forward, because you would have to bring in, on-lot sewer, on-lot water systems to accommodate the multifamily, or figure out how you're going to run public systems. So maybe having those uses where some infrastructure, the roads, et cetera, and other systems potentially could already be in place might be a discussion item to consider. And then focusing additional housing, we talked about this, and this was also in the survey, mixed use in and near Kimballsville, whether that's additional houses.
Let's see what I have left.
Whether that's additional houses, or whether that is if new infill buildings are built, because there's certainly a lot of infill opportunity in Kimballsville. Would it be a commercial use on the bottom and then maybe apartment use on the second floor to accommodate, some of that fair share of housing? And also for the businesses, if the plan that you're developing in Kimballsville is implemented and becomes a reality, having businesses in Kimballsville and then having a population there of residences that would use those businesses, whether it be a coffee shop, that was one that was mentioned a couple times in survey results, or some kind of little store, some kind of services, or in Kimballsville, having that population right there to be able to use those services is certainly helpful to the businesses. And then I already covered this, but if there's multifamily opportunities near the current apartment complex, which is called Wagner Apartments Heritage Village. Then we talked about this a little bit. The township does have an accessory dwelling unit ADU ordinance that was relatively recently adopted in the township. And just looking at that ordinance and ensuring it provides, for aging of place, which we've talked about through this planning process, and basically another kind of rural housing alternative. So right now, how it works, if you look at bullet point 2, is the ADU provisions allow for the detached ADUs on properties of 3.5 acres or less. And so we were just thinking, is there a way to look at those particular provisions to, first of all, and continue to encourage ADUs as another form of housing, and then also, how should there be a maximum square footage put on ADUs, just to make sure they remain an accessory use to the principal dwelling. We talked a little bit about that way earlier in the process. How do you know which is the accessory dwelling unit, and how do you know which is the principal dwelling? It seems evident at the time, dwelling units are created, but as time goes on, sometimes it becomes less and less evident.
The 3.5 is for a detached. So you can still have an ADU on less than 3.5 acres.
Okay, I'll just reword this to make sure it's worded more clearly.
Do we still, we just went through, do we still want to consider having detached ADUs on properties of 3.5 or less? We just went through that. I would think there's not a lot of popularity in that.
Okay, like the separate, I guess they call them like tiny homes or granny flats, or those, there's not a lot of popularity for that.
Not for properties of 3.5 or less.
Okay.
Because that's typically now basically under 3.5, we're talking about in a development. So the big concern, all of a sudden somebody builds a detached ADU next door, possibly on both sides, big concern about that. Changes. That's why the ADU was allowed, but not detached. Is that,
Okay, that makes sense. So should we just strike this then? Is that what the recommendation is?
I would say strike it because we just went through it.
Okay. Okay, we were just trying to figure out another way to incentivize or to, make it more.
It just can't be, so you can still have it. It just can't be detached.
Right, right.
So that's the happy medium.
Okay. Okay. You can still have it on that acreage. It just has to be attached to the building.
Exactly.
So as part of the building itself, or as an attached, like a second floor to the attached garage or one of those sorts of things.
Exactly.
So it couldn't be in a garage that was converted, basically. Detached.
Yeah, you'd have to attach the garage.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so we'll just strike that. And then we talked about tiny homes and how to incorporate them into zoning a subdivision. I mean, basically tiny homes they're basically a modern version of mobile homes. So the regulations really wouldn't have to be that much different than mobile home parks. There might be some slight differences, but you could either amend the zoning regulations for mobile home parks to include tiny homes, or basically create tiny home regulations in and of themselves that are mimicked off of the mobile home park regulations. But a lot of how they function and how they're built really is pretty much the same. So if there aren't any questions about that, I am going to move on to, remember I said there's these other chapters that have land use recommendations in them. And one of them is the Kimblesville chapter. And this is where you will start to see some repetition, but this whole thing that you're seeing from here on out will be lifted up and moved back to the Kimblesville chapter. And at the time we reviewed the Kimblesville chapter, the task force thought it was important to have land use recommendations with that chapter. So the chapter stays as almost one independent functioning chapter and doesn't have to refer back to this chapter, was the thought process. So the general recommendation is zoning changes that will allow for additional types of land uses, and also areas near Kimblesville as primary areas for any planned growth in the township. And that makes sense as your growth area effectively in the township. Why do this? We've already gone over this before. So the first action item that you all talked about is, how do you change the village district to promote compatible village scale uses? Now, while we skimmed the subject in the prior pages that I just talked about, this is where we're really getting into the weeds on how you would look at the village district. Because remember, this is a very specific Kimblesville chapter, the Kimblesville chapter. So we are getting into the weeds and other items on Kimblesville. So basically right now, Chesterville and Kimblesville both have this V village zoning district, and they're the same district, but how this plan envisions those two villages is very different going forward in the future. So it's probably worth the township's while to at least investigate, should there be two separate village districts? And I think that does make sense, because Kimblesville will be the planning of it is this recreation and agritourism destination, and also maybe to accommodate some mixed uses, whereas Chesterville is probably going to stay pretty much, as it is, maybe expand slightly, but not this vision as this township community center. So these recommendations go into much more detail about what I just said in very general terms, and even gets down to the level of saying, in order to make sure that you keep these small scale commercial uses, because remember the survey results said residents or respondents aren't interested in having these larger scale uses, particularly in and around Kimblesville. I've done regulations before, and a number of communities in the county have regulations that actually say what the square footage, the maximum gross leasable square footage should be in the commercial uses, in order to make sure that the sizes stay smaller and more village scale. So then the next action item looks at looking at the V district and the boundaries in Kimblesville, and also looking at the National Register eligible historic boundaries and the Act 167 district boundaries. And these boundaries are all slightly different in Kimblesville. So the question is, going forward in the future, do you want to keep them all different if you're going to be looking at changing the V zoning district in Kimblesville, or do you want to have the same boundaries for all three, or do you want to maybe have the same boundaries for the local historic district and, then the village district? Like, how do you want to go about rectifying those? And maybe it's okay how it is now. I'm not saying it isn't, but now that you have new policy for Kimblesville and a vision for Kimblesville as this community center, these boundaries definitely and how they interact with one another should be further looked at. And then next recommendation is, so you have the commercial industrial zoning centered around Kimblesville. And then the idea is, well, one municipality in particular, I've worked, has done this, where they have a basically historic village core, which is sort of this mixed use commercial residential core. And then they have a buffer district that goes around the village core, and that captures mostly non-residential, some residential, uses. And it's really a transition area where you're going from the very rural areas of the township into maybe some of these commercial and industrial uses. Your SU district sort of does it in a way, but in a very, a very, very specific area of the township and a very specific district. This would be more of a buffer all around the village as a transition area, and to accommodate maybe some slightly larger scale uses that are not crazy large. We're not talking a major mall, but some large scale uses that then transition between the smaller scale, really tight in village, and then your more expansive rural areas. And then again, we talked about this already, but now this is getting into the details. Are there higher density opportunities within and near Kimblesville Village for housing? And again, this goes back to that fair share analysis and accommodating some of these other housing types, and also just creating a population base for whatever potential businesses are going to come into Kimblesville. And you have a population base right there to patronize the businesses. It just makes sense logically from a land use pattern where you already have the road network, you already have, the infrastructure. If you do the future residential or the future walkway system in Kimblesville, you already have the walkway in place to accommodate some of these other types of uses. And then moving on to ag retention, and this is the last bit we have to review for tonight. So these are the land use recommendations that will be put back into Chapter 3. And now, Kathy, you can see how the land use recommendations mesh for the ag retention chapter back into the land use chapter itself. When we were doing the ag retention chapter, the action that was written as it was written, the task force changed that, and the new action is written here. So instead of this encourage development, the action was changed to direct development that's appropriate for the continuation of agriculture. So we have that the rewritten recommendation there. And then a couple action items under that. So you saw in the general land use chapter that we have look at how to reduce conflicts between residential development and agriculture. And we effectively focused on the educational process. This is now getting into more of the zoning and the regulatory aspects of it. So it's another angle to sort of the same action item, but getting into the details. And at one of the last meetings we had, I guess it was the agricultural retention meeting, there was a desire to have a recommendation just to explore agricultural zoning, which has been done in other parts of Chester County, and how agricultural zoning could possibly work in Franklin to encourage retention of the remaining agricultural properties. And in some cases, with agricultural zoning, perhaps to even have additional properties be farmed going forward into the future. And then it talks a little bit about state law, which is called ACRE, which does protect agricultural properties. And also it says that zoning standards should not unreasonably or prohibit or place restrictions on agricultural activities. And this is a law that, again, is a state law, and the Attorney General and in Chester County too will listen to cases about any zoning ordinances, et cetera, or other practices that are prohibiting agriculture to happen in that municipality. So we have had a number of cases in Chester County, as have, the surrounding counties. So the last action item is look at the subdivision and land development measures and encourage design that's compatible with existing agriculture. So that means, for example, if you're going to do an open space development, to the extent possible, have the open space back up to the agricultural property that's neighboring, rather than having the houses back up to the agricultural property, as an example. Another example could be look at a development design that supports agricultural uses. So, for example, if a property that's, let's say, not an agricultural property, let's say an open property is going to be developed, is there a way to have that open property developed in such a way that maybe a portion of the property, or if it is an agricultural property, a portion of the property stays or goes into farming use, and then that entire land development is built, even though it's residences, mixed use, et cetera, it's literally built around that farm, saying, this is our community supported agriculture. We're going to, buy products from this farm, and we're going to really support this farm. And this entire land development is basically built around supporting or turning this property into a farm. So looking at a little bit out of the box incentives for some creative strategies for how to maybe even increase farming in the township going forward in the future, and doing it in such a way that the residences that are in the township can actually support the farm, rather than maybe having a conflict with the farm, because they're different types of uses. And then just moving on to the very last bit of the chapter, the relation to the township vision. It's pretty straightforward. It's a land use chapter. The township vision talks about land use. And then a bunch of different resources, including, by the way, the municipality's planning code. A bunch of different resources for where you can look for some of these concepts that have been talked about in this chapter. So does anybody have any questions about that? Your current plan does have a future land use map, and that was provided to you all. And I'm bringing it up on the screen right now. Sorry, I'm going a little hoarse. And basically it shows the residential developments that had already happened, which you're seeing in this yellow color, these more rural conservation areas in the green color, and then your area around Kimblesville, and then the area around Kimblesville is more of the hinterlands. I don't know what they're called exactly, but that's a really quick summary of what the map shows. So yeah, the blue area is the Kimblesville. Then you have the moderate intensity, basically what we were talking about this buffer area. You have your low intensity areas, and then you have your rural, your rural areas, and this kind of green area. The developed areas, obviously this, I guess it's your yellow residential developments. And we said, if this is the Kimblesville area and the village area, then having effectively a buffer area, which is very similar to your current, township policy, but we were recommending carrying that out potentially in zoning and having a zoning buffer area. It doesn't necessarily have to be, the future land use map, I would imagine, for this plan is going to look very similar to this map, because your land use patterns really haven't changed that much since your current comprehensive plan. But if you created a buffer area, would it be this whole kind of orangey area? If you created in zoning, I don't know if it'd be this whole orangey area, but maybe the future land use map, would reflect what you would want to do with that buffer. So I think that pretty much covers everything. What we should go do now, though, is we want to go back and rate. We have about a half an hour left before the public comment. We want to go back and do the priority areas. Is that okay, Kathy? The prioritization of the action items?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. So let me scroll quickly through this, not giving you a headache here. And if you remember, we had ongoing as one of the action or one of the timeframes for implementation. We had A, which was this item should start within 2 years of the adoption of the comp plan. We had C, which was to consider starting within 5 years of the comp plan. And then we had an E for explore, the action item within the time frame of the comp plan. I think this first one is just an ongoing because this is the basis of your vision. Does that sound reasonable?
I think so.
Trying to put this in a different color. Focus small scale businesses and mixed uses, residential uses around Kimballsville. I would think you would probably want to do this with what you're doing in terms of village planning and the whole Mason-Dixon planning and all of that. Which, by the way, the grant application was submitted for the Mason-Dixon plan last Friday, just so you all know. So that has been received by our office. So what you're doing with all of that, I would think that you might want to consider this in the C category within 5 years of this plan being adopted. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah.
And then I think you want to focus the industrial uses in that C category also. It would seem logical to do them at the same time. Does that sound okay?
Yep.
And I would say this is probably going to be C, because if you're going to do zoning changes, I would think you're going to look at this all together probably. It would make logical sense.
I think so.
What do you want to do with the rural areas? Require land development, preserves lots of open space. I think based on comments, is this an explore? Or is this something you would want to look into in that same C?
I think this is explore. And Chuck, I was going to mention, I forgot.
You're on mute, Kathy. Okay.
She's got dog.
Dog's barking. Okay. We'll move on for a second and then we'll come back to what Kathy was going to say. Explore subdivision provisions. I think this is maybe more of is this more of an ongoing, or what would you, or ensure subdivision provisions? What would you all say this should happen in terms of time frame?
Ongoing?
I think that makes sense. I think this is ongoing as well.
Okay.
This is almost, I would say this is almost an AO though, because I think this is really something you all should get started on now, particularly if we're going to be talking about having the policy going forward as agritourism and really encouraging ag uses. I think getting this educational information out is pretty important. You don't want other people moving into the township that don't understand that this is the policy going forward. Does that sound reasonable?
Sure.
Okay. Reducing nonconformities. I think this is an ongoing.
Mhm.
I'm going to copy this because this is really ongoing as well. I thought I was copying that, but maybe I wasn't.
Well, and that was going to be my comment earlier when my dog started. For the one that we're uncertain about, I think this is going to go to the planning commission. So Chuck, it's probably better to talk about better language from the PC standpoint, because I think you do raise an interesting point.
Okay.
Okay.
So what do you want to give it for the priority coming out of this task force, though?
Is it C, did we say?
I think C makes.
Yeah, I think C makes sense.
I think C makes sense when you do the other ordinance changes. Why wouldn't you look at this too? Get it all done, together. And this is going to just be an ongoing one. Okay, so revitalization. So create these incentives. Again, if you're going to do ordinance updates, I don't know how you would picture an ordinance update. I don't know if you would picture that you would retain a consultant to go through the entire zoning ordinance and then retain a consultant to go through the entire subdivision ordinance. I'm not really sure how you do that in your township. That's what some townships prefer. Some townships prefer to do amendments and do more of a piecemeal situation where they look at, like, Kimblesville is your priority right now, and the areas around Kimblesville is your priority. So you look at making those zoning changes first, and then other items are lesser of a priority. So you look at those later. I don't really know how you update your ordinances in the township. So you'll all have to give me feedback on how you do that.
We take them item by item and usually package them as a package, because when you advertise, it just makes it a lot easier. They're usually not related.
Okay.
So this would be rather large, correct?
This would be rather large, yeah. So I would say maybe this is your E, your explore.
Yeah.
Sound reasonable?
That's what I would say.
Yeah, because this is a whole redevelopment strategy. The coordinate with the business group. The business group seemed interested in this happening sooner than later. I'm not saying this aspect of it. I'm saying the general developing a working group. And again, this recommendation is a little weird because it's split from, where we talk about the working group recommendation. I think that maybe in the Kimblesville chapter. So maybe I'll just write a note to myself and say, see however we ranked it there.
Okay.
Because we don't want them ranked differently. That would be kind of odd. Okay, so review zoning, how it permits home occupations. When would you all what kind of priority would this be in your list of priorities? Within 2 years, within 5 years, consider within 10 years? 5?
5, but we can always be opportunistic as the need arises, right? Because the pandemic could make it happen faster.
I would think this is a relatively small thing, so we might want to just do it quickly.
So does that mean 2 years, or
Yeah.
that would be an A? Is that what I'm hearing?
That's what I'm saying.
And then these accessory uses as part of an economic development, business retention strategy. What do you think about when you would take a look at this type of zoning?
I mean, don't we already have a big grouping of this zoning thing? Was that on the 5-year plan?
That was on the 5-year plan, but then when we were just having the discussion about how you tackle this, it sounds like how the planning commission tackles it is one grouping at a time. So
Yeah.
the other stuff was more of the Kimblesville oriented stuff. This is another aspect of zoning. So maybe it would be grouped in another grouping and not with all the Kimblesville stuff.
So I think this is just reinforcing something that we already do, because we already have accessory secondary uses.
So ongoing, that's a good point.
It's more looking at, I guess it's more looking at if those accessory uses are still appropriate and if they are really, encouraging businesses. So would you feel comfortable as ongoing then?
I think so.
I am.
And then this, of course, has to be ongoing. I think this should happen when you do your other stuff. That should be like the C. When you do your other Kimblesville stuff, you would investigate that probably then.
Sounds right.
And then what about the consider focusing other multifamily units?
Same time.
Okay. And then I think this is just maybe an ongoing thing as you update those standards.
I think you could put that well off.
And then the tiny homes might be something you might want to incorporate sooner than later, just because they are a thing.
It's a political hot potato.
So how do you want to rank that in terms of the?
I don't know. It's already been discussed. It's a political hot potato.
Oh, it is? Okay. It's not just being treated like a mobile home then? From a land use perspective, a regular perspective, it almost is a mobile home. The only reason it isn't a mobile home, the difference is the building code. It's not zoning so much. It's more of a building code situation, because I believe the official definition, and there's as many definitions for tiny homes, as you can imagine, but I believe the official definition is, I think it's 450 square feet or less. And the building code cuts off. You would know this better than I would, Chuck, but the building code cuts off at like 500 square feet or something for regulating residences. So tiny homes fall outside the purview of the building code. And so it's a kind of a weird.
If it's in there, I've never seen it, but that doesn't mean it's not in there. I don't know. That's
That's what I mean. It's not in there because I think the building code cuts off.
No, I mean, in the building code, I've never seen that the building code says there's a minimum square footage.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But that doesn't mean that it's not in there. I don't know.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah, that's what I've been told by code officers, that the
Mhm.
tiny homes, and again, this is a Pennsylvania issue. This is not a national issue.
Yeah.
This is the Pennsylvania issue and, the Uniform Construction Code in Pennsylvania. So
Maybe it's in that. Yeah.
that's what we're calling the building code, because, most municipalities just adopt the Uniform Construction Code, but there is this weird, like, limbo area where tiny homes effectively function as mobile homes in how they're built and how people live in them and where they're located and all of that. But
Well,
the building
so
might have to be amended,
a a mobile home actually, from the building code standpoint, doesn't apply because it's manufactured. So manufactured homes fall under a different category. They're not reviewed by the building code. So if it's a tiny home and chances are it's going to be manufactured, you're probably not going to site build it. You're probably not going to site build a tiny home, but you might. I don't know. But I don't know. It becomes, even if the home's tiny, you still have to have the same size land, same size septic field, same, all those things fall into place. So how
Right.
affordable is it?
Because it's a home, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess I'm trying to just look at it from the zoning perspective, and from the zoning perspective, it's smaller than a mobile home, but it basically functions the exact same as a mobile home. You have to have, as you were saying, septic, water, power. It's functioning the same way, whatever the size of it is. Anyway,
Yeah.
in terms of how you want to incorporate this, is this something you want to do now, or is this something you want to? Is this like an E category where you're exploring it?
I think so. Yeah, I don't see that we have a lot of pressure for that because of
Okay.
our, if we have public sewer, then that might be a bigger concern, but we don't.
Okay, then we have the Kimballsville Village Enhancement recommendations. So the first action is changing this, and I think this should be a C because that's what we've done for all the other ones.
Yep.
I would imagine when you look at this subject, you also want to look at how all these different boundaries around Kimballsville function together. So I think that would be a C. That would seem like a logical time.
Mm-hmm.
And then this whole buffer zoning area, I would think you would want to do that at the same time you do Kimballsville.
Yep.
And then this is also going to be a C. That would make logical sense to just get it all done at once.
Yep.
So then ag retention, our last ones. So this is where we start to get into the minimal, conflicts. And this is where we have explore implementing agricultural zoning. I think this is probably an E for you all. This is more of a longer term thing, right?
Yep.
And then some of the design standards in the agriculture, for agriculture in the subdivision ordinance. I mean, some of these are kind of cool, like the whole CSA development, around an agricultural parcel to help the agricultural parcel potentially have a market. But some of them are kind of, interesting concepts, but I don't know where they would fall in your realm of priorities.
It's not ongoing because we're not currently doing it. So
No.
I think it's an E.
Okay, you think it pushing it off a little further?
I think it takes some exploration to.
Okay, so we have gotten through the entire chapter, Kathy, and it is 8:07, and so I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great. Hopefully my dogs will allow this. And I don't know, there we go. Terrific. So do we have any comments? So thank you, Chuck, very much for riding herd on those letters while I was on mute. I appreciate it. And I agreed with all of them. Any comments from the public? We could open this up to public comment, editing. Nope. All right. And then can we go back to the agenda, Janine? Can you just show that?
I have to find it in all my different windows here.
Yeah, I know. Okay. Yep, so let's scroll down. if you don't mind. There we go. All right, so then I thought we could, now Chuck, did you have any other comments in general? I know Barry had something, but Barry's not here. We'll wait on that. All right, well then, can we talk about, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so I had a couple of things about roads. I don't know if we want to go back to it. It's up to you.
Well, I think at this point, because you're going to get another whack at this, which I think is great, actually, when I think about it. I don't know if that was the plan, but I think it is nice. There will be another whack at this with the Planning Commission, which I think will be a more fulsome conversation because it'll be people who really know how these things work.
Yeah.
So I instead of us just fumbling around, I'd rather now let the more experienced people address those topics, if that's okay with you, and an appropriate use of everyone's time.
That's fine.
That makes sense to you? Great. Awesome. All right. Well then, so our next meeting then, we're the last Thursday of every month, right? Janine? So we're going to skip next month. And then
Tuesday, last Tuesday of every month. I think you just said
Tuesday. Yeah.
It was like, I was sitting there like, what?
No.
What?
Since the pandemic started, I can't tell Sunday from Tuesday from Friday. Yeah. So the last Tuesday, which puts us at it's the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, which is just fine by me. I don't know if anybody else, that one works for me. If anybody else has a problem with that, let me know. Otherwise, we're going to go for the 30th. And then the last Tuesday is the 28th, which is the holiday week between Christmas and New Year's.
So in November, the 4th Tuesday would be the 23rd. So we're going to switch it to the 5th Tuesday. I just want to be clear for everybody.
Yeah, sorry, the last Tuesday or the 5th one. Yeah, that's right. And then I'm, with regard to the 4th Tuesday in December.
The 28th.
Yeah.
Could we either do it before Christmas or just after New Year's?
I agree with you, Jerry. I mean, I'm inclined to push to the 4th, honestly.
So you want to push into the new year then?
Yeah.
Yeah. One way or the other, I'm typically not around the week between.
Yeah. I just think it gets really crazy between, those I just think December is a wash. I'd rather.
We've got people coming in from Europe, so.
Oh, nice. That's really cool.
We'll do January 4th then. So we'll do November 30th and then January 4th.
Does that squeeze you, Janine? In terms of the end of January meeting? You had 2 meetings in January?
Well, in theory, after these 2 meetings, the entire plan should be, that's going to be the final draft. And then in theory, what we do is we take your comments, we incorporate them, and then this task force effectively dissolves. And then the process is moved on to the municipality's planning code process, where the Township Planning Commission gets it for review. You all vote to forward it to the Township Planning Commission. They get it for review, and then they hold their public meeting, et cetera, and then they forward it to the Board of Supervisors for adoption. So in theory, after we have that January meeting, the task force would be done.
Okay.
So yeah, but thank you for asking. I do appreciate that question. I really do. So thank you. Are there any other questions or?
So just so I'm clear, we're going to have a meeting on January 4th and the 25th.
We have a meeting on January 4th, and that should be our last meeting. Now, if we don't get the whole plan reviewed, then we will have our normal meeting on the 25th. We'll have an extra meeting. But how we had scheduled it originally is we were going to try to get through the whole second draft in 2 meetings, because you've seen all this information, already, and it's really going to be more just going through the couple. I mean, there really haven't been that many changes to the chapters. So it's going to be going through the couple changes that have been made to the chapters, and then anything else, you want to talk about.
No, that's fine. I just want to make sure that I'm straight with the
Yeah.
next date. So the next one's January 4th, 2022.
Well, the next date we're going to be meeting is November 30th.
Okay.
November 30th at 6:30 p.m. will be the next date we meet on Zoom. Then after that, it'll be January 4th. And then we'll do a placeholder for January 25th. Why don't we call it that?
Understood.
Just in case, if that sounds okay with everybody.
Janine, could I ask, could you send us full-size color maps? Because trying to view them on the computer screen is difficult.
What do you mean send?
Send paper copies to the task force. Would that be a problem?
Janine, you could send those to me or Melissa, and we'll be happy to print them for anybody that wants them. And
Okay, I think it would be better if the township would print them and then either mail them out, or you all could just pick them up at the township building, maybe?
Yeah, that'd be fine. It's just hard for me, looking at it and trying to decipher the different roads and stuff like that.
Right, that makes sense. So Jeff, I will just make sure that you have the maps, that we've done so far
perfect.
to date for anybody who wants paper copies. I guess just tell him if you want paper copies, because there's no point the township printing up paper copies, extra paper copies, and then people not picking them up. So I think
No,
yes.
That's fine. And whoever wants them, if they can at least give us a couple hours notice, we'll staff to get it done.
Jeff, you can put my name on it for a paper copy. Jerry Hopka.
You got it, young man.
Perfect.
Since we have a little bit of extra time, can you tell me about, we were talking about maps, that mixed use situation? You're confident that that's what it should show?
No, I'm not. That's why I was saying if the maps
Okay.
are problematic, I wanted you to email me
Okay,
and let me know what it should be, as opposed to me making a guess. Just
Okay.
say, this should not be mixed use. This should be, I don't know, commercial.
Yeah.
But this should be,
yeah,
But the
one of
mixed
them's
category-
residential. Yeah, one of them's a single family home. The other, I'll explain what it is, but yeah.
the mixed use category also, it's not just two uses in one building. It could be, there's a property where there's a house, and then, I don't know, the barn in the back is used for an office or something. And so under the county tax records, it's considered both residential and commercial because the property is actually being used for both.
Right.
Can you bring that map up again, please?
Sure. I think it's this one. That is definitely not the one. It's this one.
Now, Chuck, is that the one on the left there? Is that the old farmhouse on the corner?
Yeah.
Now, I know years ago, Chuck, that was
Yeah.
a house, and then the building, the small building next to
Frame
it
shop.
was
Yeah.
a frame shop.
Yeah. But I
And the
mean, that's
one-
not existing anymore.
No.
Now it's just a house and that's it. I mean, the other house is vacant. The frame
Nope.
shop is vacant.
No,
So
granted, you're 1,000% correct. And the one on the right doesn't make sense to me.
now that's in Heather Hills. So
Right.
it's a house.
Right.
So they stuck out because they're right next to me. So.
Yep.
I will email.
Perfect. And anybody else that has any changes to the maps also, email me. Because again, this was the best shot in time that we could do, based on that information. But that information may not be current if something went out of business or whatnot.
So do we have Chesterville as village zoning on this map?
Well, this is the existing land use map, not the zoning map.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can we go back to that one?
The zoning map?
Yeah. I'm getting a note from Paul. Chesterville is village zoning.
So are we going to abandon that?
Not here, but
I think the other one kind of pushes us towards, which it doesn't make sense to do village.
I agree. But I don't know. Yeah, I'm saying that's why the area. Oh, he's
A
saying
lot
that's
of
why the
places
area-
have it. That's not unusual at all. In fact, I'm working in a municipality now that has had two villages for, I don't even know how long, ages. They've had two villages because they have two villages and they're very different places. So it didn't make sense to have the exact same designation in both places because one is a much more intensive village, than the other one is. I'm not saying that's the direction you should go in. I'm just trying
Yeah.
to, it's not that unusual to do that because villages are unique places.
So so I'm interpreting that what you're saying is that instead of changing Chesterville from a V
Change Kimblesville.
to something other than V, something a little more denser.
Yeah,
This
you
village
could
is not very dense.
as it is, and just call it, I don't know, VC for Village Chesterville, and
Yeah.
then change Kimblesville and call it VK.
Yeah.
So if you're happy with Chesterville, you could leave it alone. Maybe when you're looking through it, though, maybe there's some tweaks you want to make or whatnot. But yeah, I'm not saying you have to change both of them. It's more of the concept of having the villages divided into their own, their own zoning area.
One landowner owns 70% of Chesterville Village. Because on either side of the road there, those two pieces are owned by the
Maybe
same.
two pieces.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And what's their current land use? These two pieces?
One is a nursery, and the other he simply purchased, and it's just a single. There's two homes on it. Only one's occupied, and the other half of it is farmed.
Okay, well, I mean,
He
that's
might be, yeah, he might be a little upset if the zoning changed to something other there, because he has pretty good zoning. But I don't know how that all plays out.
yeah, I don't know how that plays out either. And again, the recommendation really was more geared at Kimblesville and how the future plans for Kimblesville are different than the future plans for, Chesterville.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the
Well,
V1, V2 was more just a way to distinguish them. It was just, a made up term to be able to distinguish them in the future.
yeah, the two historic buildings in Chesterville.
So
They're not even in good shape. So
Right. Okay.
are there any other comments or are we good?
I don't have any. I'm just, Paul's texting, so let me give him a second. If there's anything else you want to add. He was just saying on I have a dot from him. Hang on.
Okay.
He's done. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all. Good seeing you all.
Yes,
Thank
you
you, Janine.
too.
yep.
Thanks,
And
guys.
yeah, take care.